In Section 2, continuing under the theme of domestic transportation and the integrated supply chain, we're going to start getting into the operational nitty-gritty of domestic on-forwarding. Before we do that, we're going to provide a little bit of a history lesson around trucking, which is actually quite relevant and will come back into focus when we start talking about pricing models. Let's begin by saying that in this entire module, the modes of domestic on-forwarding that we will study is drayage, ocean port drayage, truckload, also known as FTL, full truckload, LTL, less than truckload, and intermodal, specifically truck to rail to truck, which is a big component of the tail end of an import supply chain. Lots of intermodal transportation that is born of an import shipment. As we will soon see, each of these modes has its own operational requirements, nuances, and pricing structures. But as a note, we'll say that domestic air freight will not be covered in this module. And that's really because the lion's share of domestic on-forwarding is done via truck, be it FTL, LTL, and or intermodal, or just straight up drayage. Remember, we're talking about getting goods out to a distribution point where we terminate our discussion on the import supply chain. We'll leave domestic air freight out of that conversation. Let's begin with a relevant introduction to the U.S. trucking industry and how it got to where it is today, especially from a pricing perspective. Consistent with other modes of transportation in the U.S., and we're talking the airlines, the rail industry, prior to 1980, the U.S. trucking industry, as well as those other industries, were regulated in terms of price and operations. In the case of trucking, prior to 1980, it was regulated by the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission. As we note in our second bullet, the ICC focused on regulation in three pretty important areas. Price controls. That is to say, that prices were fixed in the trucking industry. Market entry requirements, which is also a polite way of saying that the ICC controlled who could come into the industry and arguably, perhaps in a cynical fashion, limit the amount of entrants to control competition. Lastly, the ICC was also involved in the classification of firms of trucking companies. Were they contract carriers versus common carriers? We have a bunch of definitions we're going to go through. We'll define contract versus common carrier when we get to that part. Suffice it to say on this slide that the ICC ran the show in terms of domestic trucking in the United States, in terms of price, who could play in that market, and the classification of companies that were in the market. What we're going to talk about now is how the pricing component was structured in that ICC world. Back in those days, trucking companies had to join what was called a rate bureau and were able to set prices collectively. That was done usually on a regional fashion, northeastern United States, southwestern United States, but these rate bureaus were all over the place. And they essentially fixed the prices for trucking. As we said, and reiterate in our second bullet, rate bureaus, these were regional organizations with members developing freight classifications and corresponding rates. The members were the trucking companies themselves. But anyone that is familiar, especially with LTL, less than truckload transportation, will know that freight classifications are a very important, if not vital, component of the whole LTL pricing model. We'll get to that later. But this historical perspective we're talking about really does set the stage for modern LTL transportation. This is where it all started. Freight classification being one of those early foundational decisions that the trucking industry made as it relates to the pricing of LTL services. Last bullet, the ICC was responsible for making sure that these rate bureaus and their members did not violate what were called standards of fairness when setting prices. That might seem like a bit of an oxymoron. It probably was. Because at the end of the day, price setting, or to use a less flattering term, price fixing, is very much in contrast to concepts like standards of fairness. In the end, the ICC could set rates as well as affix a minimum or maximum price. To protect these rate bureaus, they were made exempt from antitrust laws by the Reed-Bullwinkle Act of 1948. Just there we can see how far back the ICC goes in its control and regulation and price fixing of trucking in the United States. 1948 was just after World War II, so it was pretty well established. This whole idea of antitrust and being exempt from that really set the stage for full control by the trucking industry because they weren't subject to antitrust laws, anti-monopoly laws. Things started to change, albeit slowly, as we see in Bullet 2, with the Motor Carrier Act, the MCA of 1980, where federally the U.S. trucking industry was deregulated. This is right around the same time, beginning with Jerry Ford, who was president in the late 70s, and Jimmy Carter into the 1980-1983 timeframe. We're very much focused on deregulating air transportation for both cargo and passengers, deregulating rail transportation. Trucking, a big part of that movement. The fact that it started in 1980 is no historical coincidence. The goal, as we see in our sub-bullet, was more market-driven rate structures for both FTL and LTL, which is to say that the dynamics of supply and demand in the trucking industry would set rates, not some rate bureau in Seattle or Orlando or New York or wherever. With all that said, last bullet, it took several years for the U.S. trucking industry to achieve an entirely market-driven pricing system. It took a long time, actually, better part of 15 years, as we'll see in just 1 second. Here was the problem. In spite of the Motor Carrier Act, a federal law, the U.S. states were still allowed to regulate trucking until 1995. There was a 15-year period in there when state-specific regulation could take place. However, second bullet, the ICC Termination Act of 1995 eliminated the ICC and removed the requirements for rate classification and tariff filing. Interesting to note that while price fixing was not allowed, rate classification evolved into the current LTL rate classification schematic that we have today that we will study in upcoming sections. Rate classification for LTL, which is really the driving force between distinguishing dense cargo from voluminous cargo, still very much in play, still a big deal as it relates to importers getting goods out into a distribution network. More on that in just a bit. In our sub-bullet, the ICC Termination Act preempted the regulation of trucking by individual states. That just means that the states could no longer, on their own, regulate trucking. Since that time, the U.S. trucking industry has evolved into a multiplayer ecosystem. Just like we saw in ocean freight, just like we saw in customs brokerage, in air freight, there are a bunch of players that have to be clearly identified and clearly defined. That's what we're going to be working on as we move forward. One good thing about the U.S. trucking industry relative to ocean freight, air freight, the number of players and what they do is more easily identifiable because there aren't as many. That doesn't make it less complex. It just makes it easier to define. Let's talk about who those players are. Some quick definitions here. A motor carrier. Very simply, a company that transports passengers or property for compensation. Sometimes people forget that there are pretty big busing companies out there that provide transportation for human beings. They're considered a motor carrier. Needless to say, our focus is on the transport of property for compensation. Within that general framework, we have a common carrier, and that's any carrier that is engaged in the interstate transportation of persons or property on a regular schedule at published rates whose services are for hire for the general public. That's also a broad definition, but an important one, as we see. Interstate transportation, that's crossing state lines, of persons or property on a regular schedule. That's another important component, at published rates, which are oftentimes, if not always, discounted by the common carriers for specific companies. We'll talk more about that later, too. And those services are for hire to the general public. Finishing up this slide, a contract carrier is engaged in interstate transportation of persons or property by motor vehicle on a for-hire basis, but under continuing contract with one or a limited number of customers to meet specific needs. This isn't straight up FTL or LTL out in the general sphere. It is a motor carrier that provides services specifically under contract with one or probably a number of customers. Key phrase there being contract. That's a little bit different, a contract carrier, from a private carrier. As we see here, a private carrier is one that provides transportation services to the firm that owns or leases the vehicles and does not charge a fee. You may have heard the term private fleet. Walmart, good example. Target, another. We see their trucks on the road all over the country. In many instances, and those are just two examples, but a Walmart or a Target owns or leases those vehicles, and it's their own fleet. They're not charging themselves a fee. They have to account for the cost of that internally as a company, but it's a private affair. Again, private carrier, contract carrier, there's a difference. Two very important definitions that we'll talk a lot about as we move forward. The second bullet, full truckload. We'll use the acronym FTL quite frequently, but an FTL carrier is a firm that picks up and delivers trailers loaded by a shipper to a destination within the U.S. It's a full truckload, very typically from one shipper to one consignee. Doesn't always have to be that way, but the truck is full, undercarriage, most often from one shipper to one consignee. LTL, as we see in our last bullet, also plays a big role in domestic on-forwarding, and that's a trucking company that specializes in the consolidation of cargo from multiple shippers to multiple consignees within the U.S., just like we saw ocean freight consolidation in our module on ocean shipping, that LCL, less than container load. We also saw it in air freight. That is the essence of the air freight industry, consolidated shipping. Multiple shippers going to multiple consignees in the same trailer, in the case of trucking, during the same time frame. We'll get into both of these, FTL and LTL, quite extensively. We still have a bunch of definitions to go through, but we're going to stop here so we can break it up properly. And when we come back for Section 3, we'll pick up with a bonded carrier, something we talked about previously we want to reiterate in Section 3.